Welcome to the Andes, and today we're going to look at the events that inspired the television show Yellowjackets, the real-life tragedy of the Uruguayan Flight 571, and ask the question, what would you do in order to survive? A terrifying catastrophe that ended with 16 out of 45 passengers surviving 72 days of hunger, cold, and physical injuries, resorting to dreadful practices in order to stay alive. No, not a single individual that was part of this story was an evil person. Rather, everything was done for the sake of survival. And while it didn't stop the rumors, slander, or speculation, none of these survivors did anything wrong. Today, we're going to cover the crash, their time in the mountains, and how they found rescue and the impact their story had. With all that out of the way, on with the show. In September of 1972, members of an amateur rugby team ranging from the ages of their late teens to their 20s from Montevideo, Uruguay, were scheduled to play a match in Santiago, Chile. They chartered a flight that would carry 40 passengers, a mixture of the rugby team and their families, and 5 crew members. And on the 12th of October, they set out from Montevideo to Santiago. Once they got over the Andes Mountains, a combination of poor weather conditions and pilot error caused the plane to crash in the middle of the mountains, resulting in the instant death of 12 of the passengers, and the plane losing its tail along with the electronics that the plane ran on. The survivors were either severely injured or managed to escape with little injury. Besides the obvious predicament they found themselves in, with no electronics or communication devices to call for help, minus a small AM transmitter radio they managed to find, the group had little to no food, no winter gear or clothes, and the altitude was thin and barely breathable. Thankfully, using the wreckage of the plane, they were able to fashion snowshoes, sunglasses, and set up an apparatus for water, and over the next few days, they worked on nursing the injured back to health. It's worth mentioning that 5 more passed away over the first night due to the cold, now bringing the number of survivors down to 28. When the flight wasn't accounted for, the Chilean Air Search and Rescue began looking for the plane, but after 8 days, they unfortunately had to call off the search. The survivors would hear the news over the radio on the 11th day. After the news, a handful of the group attempted to survey the landscape around them, seeing if it was possible at all to leave the wreckage site and go for help. Unfortunately, due to altitude sickness, malnourishment, low resources, and extreme nighttime cold, it made it near impossible to be gone for any extended period of time. It was around this time that the survivors had to make a terrible choice. With no food and not being able to find any vegetation or animals, how were they going to survive? Having no other choice, they knew they had to consume their fallen comrades. The entirety of the survivors were devout Catholics, and none of them took the decision lightly. But in the end, and after lots of prayer, they made the pact that if they would perish, the survivors would eat them. They started with the deceased, which had been preserved due to the snow, eating small morsels of skin and fat before moving on to the muscle, and then finally the organs, all the while likening it to the Eucharist, or the conversion of bread and wine to the body and the blood of Christ, as if taking the Holy Communion. Things only went from bad to worse when, on the 29th of October, an avalanche trapped the remaining survivors inside the shelter they had made out of the plane, killing 8 more. Those left alive would be trapped for 3 days and only survived by eating those that had died before them. On the 3rd day, they finally dug themselves out, and they came to the conclusion that no one was coming for them, and they would have to save themselves. 3 of the survivors gathered as many resources as they were able, building their strength over a couple of days, and even crafted a sleeping bag to help them survive the winter nights. The only option they had was to climb Mount Salir, a straight up and down, steep and treacherous climb even for experienced climbers. The men left for their journey on the 12th of December, but the 3 wouldn't get to the top of the mountain peak until 3 days later, the survivors watching them climb for all 3 days. Once they reached the top of the mountain, they only saw snow-capped mountains surrounding them in all directions. The three coming to the conclusion that one of them would have to return to the crash site so as to not drain the rations they had taken. Once the two men examined their situation, one of them stated, quote, "We may be walking to our deaths, but I would rather walk to meet my death than wait for it to come to me. Now, let's go die together." They descended the mountain, heading towards a valley, for 7 days, and it wasn't until they met the snow line that they found signs of life, and on the 9th day found a herd of grazing cows. Finally, on the 10th day, they came to a river, and on the other side of the river was a man on horseback. The men began communicating with each other via notes going back and forth over the river, and once he had realized who he was talking to, sped off to find rescue for the others. Once word had gotten out that the Uruguayan rugby team was still alive, reporters from all over the country traveled to interview the two men, who had been taken to Santiago by the military. One of the men was then taken back by helicopter to the crash site, where they would retrieve the remaining survivors. All 14 survivors would be brought back to Santiago over the course of 2 days, the 22nd and the 23rd of December, 2.5 months since the crash. Sometime later, during a press conference, the men would speak about their ordeal, but would say they had survived off of eating cheese and other food that they had brought with them. But after they ran out, they resorted to eating the local vegetation. Unfortunately, some members of the media began to spread rumors that they had resorted to cannibalism, but that they had killed the others in order to save themselves. With the media circus beginning to spin out of control, they held another press conference on the 28th of December. Only this time, they admitted to everything that had occurred over their 72-day ordeal, including cannibalizing their deceased comrades in order to stay alive. Though the public outcry was intense, after they had explained themselves, it began to die down, and even a local bishop and Pope Paul VI contacted them, informing them that they were absolved of any sins and wouldn't face damnation. But most importantly, the families of those that had passed reached out in forgiveness and understanding. At the end of all of this, what is there to say about the tragedy in the Andes? Well, this is a story of survival, courage, hope, and heroism. When many would have given up and left themselves to die in the mountains, some found the courage to endure, to persevere, and to find the hope that others had lost. There is no antagonist, no villain, no evil, just men and women versus nature and the will to survive. To this day, the survivors struggle with the events of the crash, but they still gather once a year to commemorate their time in the mountains, celebrate the fallen, and rejoice in their rebirth. Since their ordeal, various films, documentaries, and TV shows have been inspired by their story, including Yellowjackets. And though the real-life story isn't as dramatic, there are lessons to be learned from the courage on display by the survivors. At the end of the day, the question remains, what would you do to survive? The men who hiked 10 days weren't hiking for themselves, but the lives of their companions and the lives they'd create and touch should they survive. So perhaps that is the question we should ponder after this video ends. What would you do for your fellow man?